Everyone, my name is Jane and I'm here to do a presentation on result-based regulation as implemented by the Ministry of Environment in 2015. My presentation will be in form of a policy brief. I'll first of all present what the issue is, the background, the analysis and implications, the conclusions, and then I'll give my recommendations. The issue is like what I'm focusing on my presentation, which is basically the limitations of the prescriptive regulation in governing the environmental protection activities in Saskatchewan and the subsequent implementation of the result-based regulation by the Ministry of Environment in 2015. The Ministry of Environment has a mission, and its mission is that it provides science-based solutions, compliance and mitigation measures aimed at protecting the environment, safeguarding communities, and helping to ensure balanced economic growth and a better quality of life for all Saskatchewan residents. And one of its strategies to be able to achieve this mission is to increase its regulatory certainty and transparency. Before we go into the regulatory certainties and transparencies, let's look at the activities, some of the activities of the Ministry of Environment. I'm basically focusing on the activities that have moved from the prescriptive regulation to the result-based regulation. I put RER for the result-based regulation. Some of them are the hydrostatic testing on the water management and protection. It was prescriptive regulation until 2015, and it's not until 2014. And from 2015, it became under the RER Environmental Code. And these regulations are under two legislations, which is the Forest Resource Management Act and the Environmental Management and Protection Act, like you can see on the screen. We also have the forestry operations. We also have the wildland urban interface, which is about the wildfire management. Then what's prescriptive regulations? Historically, the Ministry of Environment has regulated the environment through prescriptive regulations. As its name sounds, it's about detailing the processes that the regulating organizations need to follow in carrying out the environmental protection activities. For example, in hydrostatic testing is a process whereby oil companies and other companies that make use of pipeline tends to test the pressure of the pipeline. The reason for testing the pressure of the pipeline is to be able to know if it's rigid enough to stand environmental hazards. Okay, so what they're required to do is to get water from source water, put it in the pipeline, pressure it in high temperatures, get it cool and discharge it back to the source water. However, in prescriptive regulations, it is stated that while the water is being discharged, there are some bioters that might likely go into fresh water, and there are some rust that might go into fresh water from the pipe. In the prescriptive regulation, they're required to use clothing to block the pipe such that rust and foreign bioters don't go into the fresh water. In the prescriptive regulation, they might say the length of the clothing, the weight of the clothing, the thickness of the clothing. However, in results-based regulation, what is written clearly in the environmental code is to use suitable clothing. The outcome is the most important thing. How you want to do it, how you want to make sure that no foreign bioter gets into the water. How you want to make sure that rust don't get into the water, into the fresh water, so you use suitable clothing. This is the difference between prescriptive regulations and result-based regulations. Now the question is, why did it change from prescriptive regulation to result-based regulation? The prescriptive regulation is akin to a command and control regulation that is heavily focused on process. And this focus on process tends to bring about delays in permits and approval. And a study in 2009 discovered that the province was saddled with revenue loss of $12 million in 2005. Again, during the regime of the prescriptive regulation for all environmental activities, both high and low, there was much bureaucracy in trying to carry out this permits process. And there is this little or no intuition for the regulated organizations to bring about or develop creative solutions in carrying out environmental protection activities to still maintain the standards that the Ministry of Environment desires it to maintain. And because of the strict measures of doing exactly the length, the breadth, and the width of the different materials you use for carrying out the environmental protection, there seems to be high cost of compliance in the prescriptive regulation. And another interesting bit that we can see is the potential consequences of continuing with the prescriptive regulation. In my study, I went a bit further to ask myself, okay, what happens if the Ministry of Environment hadn't done this change in future time? And I gave a hypothetical situation that if, for example, companies are not able to meet up with the strict rules on prescriptive regulation, they might be seen as being non-compliant. And when they are not compliant, they'll be charged for non-compliance. And as we all know, that companies are non-profit organization, and these companies, most of the time, when they've been charged, it goes to the production cost. From the production cost, it trails down to the final cost and final product and service, and we, the consumers, get to pay for the charge. Again, most of the companies, if they're incessantly charged, might stop production. And many of the multinational companies might decide to leave Saskatchewan. Multinational companies who are impacted by the charges might decide to leave, because studies have shown that multinational companies will rather stay in provinces, in regions where it's business friendly, than where they have strict rules and regulations. If this companies stop production and some companies leave, then there might be job losses, and there will be increase in social services. For example, there will be increase in employment insurance. There will be increase in the application of employment insurance. Like I've seen in my analysis of the previous slide, what would have happened in terms of the increase in social costs, which reduced income for the government, definitely there will be revenue losses. And when there is revenue losses, it will bring about some negative consequences in the Saskatchewan GDP. At the end of the day, it will impair the objective of the regulation. Having carried out this analysis, then the next question is, what's the way forward? The Ministry of Environment decided to have a participatory regulation with the users. The Ministry of Environment taught you to say we have to protect the environment in a more effective and efficient way that bring about innovation and accountability. And so they decided to have a conversation with the users. There were different consultation with stakeholders, and they employed the service of Clifton's Associate Limited. They also benchmarked their environmental protection legislation against some jurisdictions like Alberta, Ontario, and British Columbia. The outcome of this consultation, benchmarking, and then the service of the Cliftons was the implementation of the result-based regulation in 2015. under two acts, like I've explained initially. They were under FAMA and EMPA. And also a code was developed. The FAMA and EMPA were amended, the legislations were amended for the result-based regulation, and an environmental code, a new environmental code was developed to help in describing the activities, how the outcomes could be achieved through either acceptable solution or alternative solution. Before I explain the environmental code, I want to look at what result-based regulation is and the principle behind it. Result-based regulation is simply this process whereby the Ministry of Environment outlines the outcome it expects from the organizations who carry out the environmental protection activities. However, it allows these organizations to decide how they can achieve it. The result-based regulation, in my literature review, I got to realize that is akin to the process of management by objective that was posited by Peter Drucker in 1954. The similarity between the result-based regulation and the management by objective is that they are focused on outcomes rather than on processes. Here, the goal of the results-based regulation. Basically, the role is to develop a model that allows for innovative and improved environmental protection practices that ensures accountability, ensure that our work, the Ministry of Environment's work, is timely, science-based, and embedded with effective feedback mechanisms. That's the goal of RER. Then let's look at the environmental code, like I've mentioned before. The environmental code, this is an innovative result-based tool that provides solution on how to achieve the desired environmental outcome. Like I mentioned earlier, that it does have the alternative solution, and then it has the acceptable solution. If an organization decides to take the alternative solution, then it must be signed off by a qualified person. That sign-off has to be accepted by the Minister of Environment. Let's have a look at the Saskatchewan Environmental Code. Like you can see, SK here means Saskatchewan, ENV Environment, and then we have the code. This is the entire Saskatchewan Environmental Code. It's comprised of both. There are some activities that are actually still very high risks. The impact is very high. It has to go through the process-based chapters. And others that have lower risks that are routine go through the results-based chapters. In the result-based chapters, there are two streams here. We have the alternative and we have the acceptable. The acceptable solution is akin to the prescriptive regulation, which is still the process-based. However, the difference between the acceptable solution and the prescriptive regulation is the approval time. Initially, the approval for the prescriptive regulation has this minimum about 45 days. However, for the acceptable solution, when a company has sent in its application and have agreed to follow the acceptable solution, the approval is within 1 day. The company knows that they are accountable for the processes in achieving the outcome. If the company decides to bring about some cost-efficient ways, some other alternative measures to still achieve the objective, the environmental outcome, then they have to employ the service of a qualified person. The qualified person will have to certify the process, the method that is being carried out, and know that the qualified person's certification has to be approved by the Minister of Environment. Basically, the use of the qualified person is like transferring the old processes that are being carried out by the environmental protection officers to a qualified person. However, the qualified person is still vetted by making sure the minister accepts his certification on the process. Then what's the benefit of RBR? And we can see very well that even with the acceptable solution, its approval is reduced to 1 day. So it minimizes the wait time. Again, with the environmental code, we can see that the objectives and expected outcomes are stated clearly. This is what I want to achieve at the end of the day. After your hydrostatics testing, there shouldn't be a foreign biota in the freshwater. There shouldn't be rust in the freshwater. How you want it, whatever suitable clothing you want to use, that's good. But the length, breadth, weight, color is no longer indicated in the environmental code. It improves negotiation. It improves innovation. How? Because the regulated organizations have been given the opportunity to devise alternative measures. Yes, they'll bring about cost-efficient ways to carry out these activities. Interestingly, even within the ministry, there's been a program titled the Customer Relationship CRM, for managing the customer's relationship to enable effective feedback during the approval process, during any complaints, corrective action plans they have to send. They use the CRM to communicate with the clients. Yeah, and because of the alternative measures, it provides a broader range of compliance mechanisms through alternative solutions. Because there are broader compliance mechanisms, the organizations can actually devise cost-effective measures, thereby reducing the compliance costs that would have been the contrary with prescriptive regulations. Also, RBR tends to increase the accountability of companies through their active participation in the regulatory process. Like we've seen, the RBR, interestingly, with all those benefits, one might think, oh, does it mean that the companies would have to, does it mean the Ministry of Environment is not regulating the environmental protection activities? No. RBR does not mean that there is deregulation. And RBR does not mean that the companies are being self-regulated. RBR is not a reduction of the standards that has been set by the Ministry of Environment. RBR is there to create innovations, to be able to create cost-effective ways, to be able to achieve the environmental protection activities, and also it encourages participation by the users of the environmental resources. Has RBR worked in other places? The answer is yes, it has actually worked in places. RBR has been successful in some parts of Europe. For example, in the Netherlands, when the Dutch government introduced stricter standards into buildings, into how the construction companies build houses, it gave them the opportunity to design how they wanted how they want to achieve the outcome that have been stipulated in the outcome-based model. And what really happened is that there were incremental innovations that resulted in the universal installation of more energy efficient boilers in building all over Europe. However, RBR could fail. There's some barriers to RBR. If the ministry has stipulated the outcome without efficient monitoring to see if the company is actually going through the processes, without no qualified person to certify the process, without looking at what the qualified person is certifying, then RBR might fail. If there is no sector-wide education to educate the users on what RBR is, what RBR is not, and how RBR should be implemented, it might fail. And if there are no effective feedback mechanisms, RBR might fail as well. Has RBR failed before? Yes. New Zealand actually used an outcome-based model in their buildings. The model, they developed an outcome-based building regulation in 1992, and in late 90s they actually discovered that many buildings were leaking. There were new buildings that came up, obviously. However, almost 89 homes were being affected, and New Zealand lost about in trying to mitigate this, in trying to remedy these costs, in trying for preventive measures and remediation. They actually spent about 11.3 billion New Zealand dollars. Why did RBR fail in New Zealand? It was just pretty the same thing I've said about the barriers. It lacks monitoring and from the side of the ministry and accountability from the firms. What has the Ministry of Environment done to ensure that it mitigates these inevitable risks? The Ministry of Environment has ensured greater capacity for enforcement and non-compliance, and it's also monitor and in continuous monitoring of the process to ensure that the requirements are being met. However, it also emphasized that the regulated persons are accountable to take prudent measures in protecting the environment and ensuring sustainable use of natural resources to enhance economic and social benefits. This goes to say that a regulation would only be effective when it's properly designed, properly implemented, properly monitored, and strictly enforced. In relation to the Ministry of Environment, I'll say that having implemented RBR since 2015, it's important to have those periodic assessments to know if the process is working. Let's not leave the situation just the way New Zealand left it. They started in 1992, and by towards the end of 1990s, we realized lots of leaked buildings. RBR should be assessed. The effectiveness of RBR should be assessed as a tool in enhancing environmental protection. Again, RBR also, I also advise the Ministry of Environment to assess the effectiveness of RBR to see if there are innovative ideas that have been presented by this organization through efficient means, through alternative solutions, and again to ensure continuous improvement of the results-based regulation mechanism in Saskatchewan.